The gunshot that tore through Rhett Dalton's chest wasn't supposed to kill him. The blizzard was. But Margaret Callahan, half-starved and barely alive herself, found him dying in the snow and made an impossible choice. Saving this stranger would destroy the last safety she had left. Yet she dragged his bleeding body inside anyway, cut a bullet from his ribs with nothing but whiskey and a kitchen knife, and fought death itself to keep him breathing. What she didn't know was that the men who shot him were already coming back to finish the job. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The Colorado mountains didn't care if you lived or died. Margaret Callahan had learned that truth the hard way. One frozen morning at a time, watching her breath cloud in the air inside a cabin that leaked wind through every crack in the walls. 6 months she'd been hiding in this forgotten miner's shack. 6 months since Boston society had chewed her up and spit her out like something rotten. She wasn't a nurse anymore. That life ended the night Rebecca Hartford died on the operating table while her surgeon father stood drunk in the corner, and Margaret took the blame because nobody important gets destroyed when there's hired help to sacrifice instead. The Hartford family had money, connections, lawyers who could make truth disappear like morning fog. Margaret had nothing except the clothes on her back and a one-way ticket west before the scandal turned into a prison sentence. Now she was nothing. A ghost living in a dead man's cabin, surviving on pine nuts and whatever small game she could trap, burning furniture when the firewood ran out, and pretending she wasn't slowly starving to death. The blizzard started 3 days before everything changed. Not the gentle snow that falls in paintings, but the kind that turns the world into a screaming white hell where you can't see your own hands in front of your face. Margaret had been rationing the last of her cornmeal, mixing it with melted snow to make a paste that barely qualified as food, when she realized the woodpile was almost gone. Going outside in that storm was suicide. She knew it. But freezing to death inside wasn't any better. She wrapped herself in every piece of cloth she owned, 2 dresses layered over her shift, a dead miner's coat that smelled like tobacco and decay, strips of blanket tied around her hands because she'd burned her only gloves weeks ago. Then she pushed open the cabin door and stepped into the screaming wind. The cold hit like a fist. Margaret gasped, felt ice crystals form immediately in her lungs, and forced herself forward anyway. The woodpile was only 30 feet from the cabin. 30 feet. She could make it. 10 steps in, she couldn't see the cabin anymore. 20 steps, and she wasn't sure which direction she was walking. Her hands were already numb. The wind kept changing direction, spinning her around, filling her nose and mouth with snow every time she tried to breathe. She stumbled forward, praying she was still moving toward the woodpile and not deeper into the wilderness where they'd find her body in spring, frozen solid with her eyes still open. Then her foot hit something that wasn't snow. Margaret dropped to her knees, brushing away the white powder with hands that barely worked anymore. At first she thought it was a log, maybe something she could drag back for firewood. Then she saw the blood. Black against white. Too much blood. A trail of it leading back into the storm, and at the end of that trail, a man. He was face down in the snow beside a horse that had collapsed mid-stride. The animal was still alive, barely, its sides heaving with labored breaths that sent steam rising into the frozen air. But the man wasn't moving at all. Margaret's first instinct was to run. Whatever trouble this stranger carried had nothing to do with her. She had her own death to worry about. Getting involved meant risk, meant danger, meant everything she'd spent 6 months avoiding. But her hands were already moving, rolling him onto his back, checking for a pulse. She found it. Weak, irregular, but there. Then she found the wound. The bullet had entered just below his left collarbone, tearing through muscle, and God knows what else before exiting out his back. The stranger's shirt was soaked through with blood, already freezing stiff against his skin. He'd lost so much. Too much. Nobody survives this kind of bleeding. Not out here. Not in this cold. Margaret sat back on her heels, breathing hard, trying to think through the fog in her brain that came from too many weeks of not eating enough. Leave him. The smart choice. The safe choice. He's already dead, just doesn't know it yet. But her fingers were pressing against his neck again, feeling that stubborn pulse that refused to quit. She'd sworn an oath once. First, do no harm. Seemed like a sick joke now, considering how much harm the world had done to her. But old habits die harder than people, and Margaret Callahan had spent too many years saving lives to watch a man bleed out in front of her without trying. Damn it, she whispered into the wind. Damn it, damn it, damn it. The horse was the key. The animal was dying, but it wasn't dead yet, and it was strong enough to pull. Margaret grabbed the stranger under his arms and started dragging him backward through the snow, her feet sliding, her back screaming in protest. 20 feet. Then she had to stop, gasping, her vision going dark at the edges. She'd forgotten what real food felt like. Her body was running on fumes and spite, and neither one was going to last much longer. But she got him to the horse, used the saddle rope to tie him in a position where the animal could drag him. The horse tried to stand when she pulled on its bridle, stumbled, almost fell again. Margaret slapped its neck hard, shouting words she'd learned from the miners, words that would have gotten her thrown out of Boston society even faster than the scandal had. The horse stood. Getting back to the cabin nearly killed them all. Margaret couldn't see anything, could barely breathe, could only pull the horse forward step by step and pray she was going the right direction. Her hands were so numb she couldn't feel the rope anymore. The stranger made a sound once, a low groan that might have been pain or might have been his last breath leaving his body. Then suddenly there was wood under her hand, the cabin wall. She'd made it. Getting the stranger inside took everything she had left. She untied him from the horse, grabbed him under the arms again, and pulled him up the 2 steps to the cabin door. He was heavy, dead weight, and Margaret's strength was gone. She fell twice, landing hard on the frozen ground, her head spinning, her stomach trying to turn itself inside out, even though there was nothing in it to lose. But she got him inside. The cabin was barely warmer than outside, but at least the wind couldn't reach them here. Margaret kicked the door shut, dragged the stranger close to the fireplace where a few coals still glowed red, and finally let herself collapse beside him. For maybe a minute, she just lay there on the floor, breathing, listening to the storm hammer against the walls. Then she forced herself to move. The fire first. She threw on the last pieces of furniture she'd been saving, a 3-legged stool, part of an old crate, some pine branches she'd gathered weeks ago. The flames grew, throwing heat and light across the small room, and Margaret could finally see what she was working with. The stranger was maybe 30, maybe older. Hard to tell under all that blood and dirt. Dark hair, strong jaw, hands that were rough and scarred from work. A working man, not some soft city type. His clothes were good quality but well used, leather vest, wool shirt, sturdy boots that had seen plenty of trail time. And that wound. Still bleeding, but slower now. The cold had probably saved his life, keeping his heart from pumping out every drop he had left. Margaret had exactly 1 bottle of whiskey, saved from a dead miner's stash. A kitchen knife that was almost sharp. Thread she'd pulled from the hem of her spare dress. And absolutely no idea if any of it would be enough. She'd done surgery before, back when she was someone, back when she had proper tools and proper training and proper support. This wasn't surgery. This was butchery with a prayer attached. She poured whiskey over the knife, poured more over the wound. The stranger jerked, made a sound like a dying animal, but didn't wake up. "You better live through this," Margaret told him, positioning the knife. "Because I'm not doing this for nothing." The bullet was still inside. She could feel it when she pressed on the wound, a hard lump buried in torn muscle. Had to come out. No choice. Leaving it meant infection, and infection out here meant death just as sure as bleeding. Margaret took a breath, said a prayer to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, and started cutting. The stranger screamed when the knife went in. His whole body went rigid, back arching off the floor, and Margaret had to pin him down with her knee across his chest while she worked. Blood poured fresh, hot against her freezing hands, and she couldn't see anything, could only feel her way through destroyed tissue looking for that piece of metal. Her fingers found it, slippery, buried deep. She couldn't get a grip. The stranger was thrashing now, still unconscious but fighting anyway, and Margaret was losing him. Could feel it. His pulse was getting weaker, his breathing more shallow, and if she didn't get this bullet out right now, he was going to die on this cabin floor. She dropped the knife, shoved her fingers into the wound, and pulled. The bullet came out covered in blood and tissue, and Margaret threw it across the room before pressing both hands over the hole in the stranger's chest. Blood poured between her fingers. Too much. She grabbed the whiskey bottle, poured it directly into the wound, and the stranger's scream could have woken the dead. "Stay with me," Margaret heard herself saying. "Stay with me. Stay with me. Don't you dare die on me now." She packed the wound with cloth torn from her spare dress, pressed down hard, and waited. The bleeding had to slow, had to stop. If it didn't, nothing else mattered. 1 minute passed. 2. The cloth was soaked through, but fresh blood wasn't pooling as fast. Margaret added more pressure, her arms shaking from exhaustion, her vision swimming. 3 minutes. 4. The bleeding slowed. 5 minutes, and it stopped entirely. Margaret sat back, gasping, staring at her hands. They were covered in blood up to the wrists, shaking so hard she could barely control them. The stranger was still alive, still breathing, pulse still there, still fighting. She'd done it, and now she was trapped in a cabin with a dying man during the worst blizzard she'd ever seen, with no food, almost no firewood, and absolutely no idea who he was or why someone had shot him. Smart, Margaret, she told herself. Real smart. But she was already moving, checking the wound again, adding clean bandages, covering him with the only blanket she owned. Outside, the storm screamed like something alive and furious. The cabin shook. The fire flickered, threatened to go out, and Margaret fed it more of the broken stool. The stranger's breathing changed. Steadier now, deeper, like maybe his body had decided to keep fighting after all. Margaret found his saddlebags by the door where she'd dropped them, opened them hoping for food, and found something better: jerky, hardtack, a full canteen of water, and a bag of coffee beans that made her want to cry. Rich man's food. Trail supplies meant for long rides through hard country. She ate 2 pieces of jerky so fast she barely tasted them, her stomach cramping around the sudden food. Forced herself to slow down, couldn't afford to get sick. Not now. While she ate, she checked the stranger's pockets. Looking for weapons first. Found a revolver, good quality, fully loaded. Then looking for identity. A wallet with $40 inside, more money than Margaret had seen in months. And a letter, folded small, addressed to someone named Clara Dalton. Dalton. That was a name she'd heard before, even out here in the middle of nowhere. Ranch family. Big spread somewhere in the valley. Money and land and the kind of power that came with both. So this stranger bleeding on her floor wasn't just anybody. He was somebody. The kind of somebody who had enemies willing to shoot him and leave him to die in a blizzard. The kind of somebody whose problems were about to become her problems. Margaret looked at the $40, then at the man, then at the storm still raging outside. She could take the money and run when the weather cleared. Leave him here, let him take his chances, save herself. That was the smart play. The safe play. But she was already soaking another cloth in warm water, already cleaning the blood from his face, already checking his temperature with the back of her hand. Fever was coming. She could feel it. His skin was too hot despite the cold, his breathing starting to rattle in his chest. The real fight hadn't even started yet. Margaret built up the fire, boiled water, and prepared for a long night. The stranger started talking around midnight. Delirious, barely conscious, words tumbling out that made no sense. He called for someone named Clara, begged someone to stop, fought invisible enemies that only he could see. Margaret held him down when the thrashing got bad, forced water between his lips when he'd take it, and tried not to think about what would happen if he died anyway after everything she'd done. "Crow," he said once, clear as day. "Vernon Crow. Bastard. Going to kill us all." Then he was gone again, lost in fever dreams that made him sweat and shake. Margaret had heard that name too. Vernon Crow. Cattle baron from the eastern part of the territory. The kind of man who took what he wanted and didn't care who got hurt in the process. If this stranger had made an enemy of Vernon Crow, no wonder someone had put a bullet in him. Dawn came gray and cold. The storm had finally stopped, but the world outside was buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. The horse had died during the night. Margaret could see its frozen body from the window, already half covered in white. No way to bury it, nowhere to move it. Just another casualty of the mountains. The stranger was still alive, but barely. His fever had spiked during the night, and now he was burning up, shaking with chills despite the blankets piled on top of him. Margaret had seen this before. Infection setting in. Blood poisoning spreading through his system. Without proper medicine, he had maybe 2 days before his body gave up the fight. She checked the wound. Red, swollen, hot to the touch. Exactly what she'd been afraid of. "You stubborn bastard," she told the unconscious man. "You better be worth all this trouble." But she was already boiling more water, already preparing to clean the wound again, already doing everything she could with the nothing she had available. 3 days passed like a slow nightmare. The stranger's fever broke once, came roaring back worse than before. He stopped talking, stopped moving, just lay there breathing in shallow gasps that sounded like death rattling in his chest. Margaret slept in brief snatches beside the fire, waking every hour to check on him, to force water down his throat, to change bandages soaked through with fluid seeping from the wound. She'd given up hope twice, sat beside him waiting for the breathing to stop, for the fight to finally be over. But every time she was sure he was finished, his pulse would strengthen just enough to keep going. On the fourth morning, his eyes opened. Margaret was dozing beside the fire when she heard him move. Snapped awake immediately, hand going for the revolver she'd started keeping close, and found him staring at her with eyes that were clear for the first time since she'd found him. "Where am I?" His voice was rough, barely more than a whisper. "Middle of nowhere," Margaret said. "Colorado mountains. My cabin." He tried to sit up, made it about 6 inches before collapsing back with a groan. "What happened?" "You got shot. I found you in a blizzard, cut a bullet out of your chest. You've been unconscious for 4 days." The stranger processed that, his eyes tracking around the cabin, taking inventory. Smart. Even half dead, he was thinking about threats, about safety, about what kind of situation he'd woken up in. "You saved my life. Don't thank me yet. You're not out of the woods. Who are you?" Margaret considered lying, using a fake name, but she was too tired for games. "Margaret Callahan, former nurse, currently nobody. Rhett Dalton." He tried to sit up again, managed it this time with obvious effort. "Rancher, currently shot. I found your letter, to Clara." Something shifted in his expression. Fear, maybe, or concern. "My sister, I need to get back to her. Crow's men, they're going to—" "You're not going anywhere," Margaret cut him off. "You can barely sit up. You try to ride, that wound opens again and you bleed out before you make it a mile. You don't understand. Vernon Crow wants my land. He's been buying out ranchers for months, forcing them to sell, burning out the ones who won't. I'm the last one left with water rights to the valley. Without me, he owns everything. And he sent men to kill you. 3 of them." Rhett's jaw tightened. "Caught me on the trail between town and my ranch. I got one before they got me, made it into the mountains thinking I could lose them in the snow. Horse gave out. Don't remember much after that." Margaret thought about the blood trail leading to her cabin, about the storm that had covered their tracks, about how long it might take for Crow's men to come looking for the body. "They think you're dead," she said. "That's the only reason you're still alive." "Then I need to get back before they move on my ranch. Clara's there alone. The ranch hands, they're good men, but they won't fight Vernon Crow without me." He tried to stand, made it halfway up before his legs gave out, and Margaret had to catch him before he cracked his head on the floor. He was heavy, all muscle and bone, and the effort of holding him up made her vision darken at the edges. "You damn fool," she said, lowering him back down. "You want to die? Because that's what happens if you leave now. I didn't cut a bullet out of you with a kitchen knife just so you could kill yourself being stubborn." Rhett looked at her then, really looked, and seemed to notice for the first time how thin she was, how her hands shook, how her clothes hung loose on a frame that had been starving for months. "You're not doing much better yourself." "I'm alive. That's more than most people manage out here." "Why are you hiding in the middle of nowhere?" Margaret stood up, turned away, started reorganizing bandages that didn't need reorganizing. "That's not your business. You saved my life. I think that makes it my business. I was a nurse in Boston, got blamed for something I didn't do. Powerful family needed a scapegoat. I ran before they could put me in prison." The words came out flat, emotionless. She'd said them in her head so many times they'd lost all meaning. "Now I'm nobody, and that's fine with me." Silence filled the cabin. Outside, wind moved through the trees, making them creak and sway. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. "I'm sorry," Rhett said finally. "Don't be. Sorry doesn't change anything." "No, but maybe—" He stopped, grimaced, pressed a hand to his wound. "Maybe we can help each other." "I don't need help. You're starving to death in a cabin with no firewood, no food, and winter isn't even half over yet. Yes, you do." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to tell him to mind his own business, to leave her alone, to take his problems and his danger and get out of her cabin as soon as he could stand. But her stomach chose that moment to cramp with hunger, and they both heard it. Come back with me, Rhett said. To the ranch. Clara would welcome you. We have food, shelter, a real doctor in town. You could... I can't go into town. Someone might recognize me. Then stay at the ranch. We need a nurse anyway. Clara gets sick sometimes, and the ranch hands are always getting hurt. You could work for us, earn your keep, have a real place to stay instead of slowly dying out here alone. It was tempting, dangerously tempting. The thought of regular meals, a warm bed, people around instead of endless isolation. But it also meant risk, meant exposure, meant getting involved in whatever war Rhett Dalton was fighting with Vernon Crow. I'll think about it, Margaret said. That night, while Rhett slept restlessly by the fire, Margaret stood at the cabin window and watched the moonlight turn the snow blue-white. Somewhere out there, men with guns were looking for Rhett Dalton. Eventually, they'd find the blood trail. Eventually, they'd track it to this cabin. And when they did, Margaret's isolation wouldn't protect her anymore. Maybe Rhett was right. Maybe they could help each other. Or maybe she was about to make the stupidest decision of her life. Again, the decision came 5 days later, but not because Margaret wanted it to. It came because 3 riders appeared on the horizon just after dawn, and suddenly staying in the cabin meant dying in it. Rhett saw them first. He'd been strong enough to stand by the window for short periods, watching the tree line with the kind of vigilance that came from knowing men wanted you dead. Margaret was cleaning his wound. It was healing finally, the redness fading, the flesh knitting back together in a way that made her think he might actually survive this. When he went rigid. Company, he said quietly. Margaret moved to the window. 3 dark shapes moving through the snow, still distant but coming closer. Too deliberate to be lost travelers. Too focused to be passing through. Crow's men? She asked. Has to be. They found the blood trail. Margaret's stomach dropped. She'd known this was coming, had tried to prepare for it, but now that it was actually happening, her mind went blank with fear. 3 armed men. 1 revolver. A wounded rancher who could barely walk. A starving nurse with no experience fighting anyone. They were going to die here. Get dressed, Rhett said. Warm clothes. Everything you can carry. What? We're leaving, now, before they get close enough to cut us off. You can't ride, your wound. My wound doesn't matter if I'm dead. He was already moving, gathering his saddlebags, checking his revolver. How much food do we have left? Maybe 3 days' worth, less if we're both eating. Take it all. And the blankets. Whatever medical supplies you have. Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to tell him this was insane, but the riders were getting closer, and she could see the outline of rifles against their shoulders. So she moved instead, grabbing everything that might keep them alive. The dried jerky, the hardtack, her makeshift medical kit, the spare blankets, the whiskey bottle still half full. Rhett was trying to saddle his horse with hands that shook from weakness. The animal had wandered back during the thaw, half starved but alive, and Margaret had been feeding it what little grain she could spare. Now it was their only chance. Let me, Margaret said, pushing him aside. Her fingers worked the straps and buckles, movements automatic from watching stable hands back when she had a life. You'll pass out before you finish. I'm fine. You're bleeding again. I can see it through your shirt. He looked down. Fresh blood had soaked through the bandage, a dark stain spreading across the fabric. Damn it. Exactly. So let me work and you stay alive long enough for this to matter. The horse was saddled in 2 minutes. Margaret tied their supplies behind it, working fast, her hands steadier than she felt. The riders were close enough now that she could hear them calling to each other, spreading out, surrounding the cabin. Back way, Rhett said. There's got to be a back way out. There wasn't. Just the front door and 1 window too small to climb through. They were trapped. Margaret looked at Rhett, saw him doing the same calculation, coming to the same conclusion. His hand moved to his revolver. No, she said. You can't fight them. Not like this. I'm not letting them take me. And I'm not letting you die after I spent a week keeping you alive. Her mind was racing, looking for options, finding none. We need another plan. There is no other plan. The riders were at the cabin now. Margaret could hear boots crunching in the snow, voices getting closer. 3 of them, just like Rhett said. Professional, careful. Men who'd done this before. Hello, the cabin, one of them called out. Friendly tone, polite even. Just looking for a friend of ours, rancher named Dalton. You folks seen him? Margaret met Rhett's eyes, saw him shake his head slightly. Don't answer. We know he came this way, the voice continued. Tracked his blood trail right to your door. If he's in there, we just want to talk. Make sure he's all right. Liars, but dangerous liars, the kind who'd smile while they killed you. Rhett moved toward the door. Margaret grabbed his arm, held him back. He looked at her with an expression that said he was about to do something stupid and heroic and get them both killed. Let me, she whispered. Margaret. But she was already at the door, opening it just enough to show her face. The three men stood in a semicircle outside, hands near their guns, but not quite touching them yet. The one in front was older, gray hair under his hat, the kind of weathered face that came from years outdoors. The other two were younger, meaner looking, the type who enjoyed their work. Can I help you, gentlemen? Margaret kept her voice steady, neutral. Ma'am? The older one tipped his hat. Sorry to bother you. Like I said, we're looking for a man, Rhett Dalton. Tall fellow, dark hair, probably hurt pretty bad. You seen anyone like that? No, sir. Been alone here all winter. That so? His eyes moved past her, trying to see inside the cabin. Mind if we take a look around, just to be sure? I do mind, actually. This is my home. Now, ma'am, we're not trying to cause trouble, but our friend, he's hurt, lost a lot of blood. If he made it here, he needs help, medical attention. I haven't seen anyone. One of the younger men spoke up. There's a blood trail leading right to this cabin, fresh, maybe a week old. Could be from anything, Margaret said. Mountain lion, wounded deer. Lots of things bleed in the mountains. The older man's smile didn't reach his eyes. Sure they do. But this trail, it comes from a horse. And there's a horse tied behind your cabin right now that matches the description of Dalton's mount. Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it. That horse wandered in yesterday. I don't know where it came from. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time, real polite. Step aside and let us search the cabin. And I'm telling you no. The smile disappeared. Then we've got a problem. The older man's hand moved to his gun, and everything happened at once. Rhett kicked the door open, firing before it was fully open, and the older man went down, clutching his leg. Margaret dove sideways as bullets tore through the doorframe where her head had been. The two younger men scattered, taking cover behind trees, and suddenly the quiet morning exploded into chaos. Get down! Rhett shouted, but Margaret was already moving, scrambling across the floor toward the fireplace where she'd left the poker. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. More gunfire, wood splintered, glass shattered. The window exploded inward, and one of the younger men tried to climb through. Margaret swung the poker with everything she had, caught him across the face, felt bone crack under the impact. The man screamed, fell backward out of the window, blood pouring from his broken nose. Rhett was at the door, using the frame for cover, trading shots with the third man. His shirt was soaked with blood now, his face pale, but his hands were steady. 3 shots. 4. The revolver clicked empty. Reload! Margaret threw him the gun belt she'd taken from his saddlebags. Rhett caught it, fumbled with the bullets, his hands starting to shake. The third man saw the opening and rushed the door. Margaret didn't think, just moved. She swung the poker again, caught him in the knee, and the man went down hard. He still had his gun, though, bringing it up, finger on the trigger, and Margaret knew she was about to die. Then Rhett's gun fired, and the man's head snapped back. Silence fell over the cabin, broken only by ragged breathing and the sound of the older man groaning outside where he'd dragged himself behind a tree. We need to go, Rhett said. He was swaying now, holding himself up against the doorframe. Now, before he gets help. Margaret looked around the cabin. It was destroyed, bullet holes everywhere, the window gone, her meager supplies scattered across the floor, everything she'd survived on for 6 months, gone in 30 seconds of violence. Come on! Rhett was already outside, moving toward the horse. Margaret grabbed what she could, a blanket, the medical kit, the bag of food, and followed him. The older man tried to shoot them as they passed. His bullet went wide, and then Rhett was in the saddle, reaching down for Margaret. She grabbed his hand, let him pull her up behind him, and then they were moving. The horse was tired, hungry, not built for carrying 2 people through deep snow, but it ran anyway, crashing through drifts, following what might have been a trail or might have been nothing. Behind them, the older man was still shouting, Threats and curses that got quieter as distance opened up. Rhett lasted maybe half a mile before he started slumping forward. Margaret wrapped her arms around him, holding him upright, trying to steer the horse with her knees. Blood from his reopened wound was soaking through both their clothes now, warm and sticky. "Stay with me," she said into his ear. "Don't you dare die on me now. Not after all that." "Wasn't planning on it," he mumbled, but his voice was weak, his breathing shallow. The landscape blurred past. Trees, snow, more trees. Margaret had no idea where they were going, only that they needed to put distance between themselves and the cabin. The horse was flagging, its pace slowing, its sides heaving with exhaustion. Then Rhett went completely limp. "No, no, no, no!" Margaret grabbed the reins, pulled the horse to a stop. Rhett was unconscious, his skin gray, his pulse barely there. She half slid, half fell off the horse, then managed to ease him down into the snow. The wound had torn open completely, blood everywhere. She needed to stop it, needed to pack it, but her supplies were scattered between the horse's saddlebags and the bundles tied behind the saddle, and her hands were shaking too badly to work the knots. A sound made her look up. Hoofbeats, coming from the direction they'd fled. The wounded man hadn't stayed behind. He was coming after them. Margaret made a decision. She got Rhett back on the horse, tying him to the saddle so he wouldn't fall, then led the animal into the trees. 50 feet in, she found what she was looking for, a rocky overhang, deep enough to hide them, narrow enough that the snow hadn't filled it in. She pulled Rhett off the horse, dragged him into the shelter, then covered the entrance with pine branches. The horse she sent running with a slap to its hindquarters, hoping it would lead their pursuer away. Then she sat in the darkness with an unconscious man bleeding against her shoulder and waited. The rider came 10 minutes later. She could hear him moving through the trees, calling out, "Dalton, I know you're out here. You're hurt. You need help. Let me help you." More lies. Margaret pressed her hand over Rhett's mouth, even though he was unconscious, even though he couldn't make a sound. Her other hand found a rock, heavy enough to be a weapon if it came to that. The hoofbeats got closer, closer, then stopped right outside their hiding place. Margaret held her breath. Through the branches she could see the rider, the younger man whose nose she'd broken. His face was a mess of dried blood, his eyes scanning the trees, looking for any sign of them. "I'm going to find you," he said quietly, "and when I do, I'm going to make you regret what you did." He sat there for what felt like hours, listening, watching. Then finally his horse moved on, and the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Margaret waited another hour before she dared to move. Then she pulled the branches aside and looked out at a world that had gone quiet again. No riders, no sounds of pursuit, just wind and snow and the distant call of a crow. Rhett was still unconscious. His breathing was so shallow she had to keep checking to make sure he was still alive. The wound needed attention immediately, but she couldn't do anything here. No light, no supplies, nowhere warm enough to work. She needed shelter, real shelter. And she had no idea where to find it. The sun was setting when she finally got Rhett moving again. She'd managed to fashion a crude sled from pine branches and rope, tied it to herself like a harness, and started pulling. Every step was agony. Her body was already weak from months of starvation, and now she was hauling a full-grown man through knee-deep snow with no idea where she was going. But she kept moving, one step, then another, then another. Night fell. The temperature dropped. Margaret's breath came out in clouds of vapor that froze in her hair, her eyelashes, her scarf. She couldn't feel her feet anymore, couldn't feel her hands, just kept walking because stopping meant dying. Then she saw it, a dark shape against the snow. Another overhang, bigger this time, deep enough to be a cave. She pulled Rhett inside and collapsed beside him. For a long time she just lay there, too tired to move, too cold to think. Then Rhett made a sound, a low groan that meant he was still alive, and Margaret forced herself up. No wood for a fire, no supplies except what she'd managed to grab, no light except the moon reflecting off the snow outside. But she had the medical kit, and that would have to be enough. She worked by feel, cleaning the wound with snow, packing it with strips torn from her dress, binding it tight with the last of her thread. Rhett was burning up with fever again, shaking so hard his teeth chattered, and Margaret wrapped him in the single blanket they had left and pulled him close, sharing what little warmth her body could generate. You better be worth this, she told him. Same thing she'd said that first night. You better be worth all of this. Outside, wolves started howling. Close, too close. Margaret found a rock and held it ready. She was too tired to be afraid anymore. Just angry. Angry at the world for putting her here. Angry at Rhett for getting shot. Angry at herself for caring enough to try to save him. The wolves circled for hours. She could hear them moving outside the cave, could see shadows passing across the moonlight. But they never came in. Maybe they sensed the desperation inside was more dangerous than they wanted to deal with. Dawn came cold and gray. The wolves were gone. Rhett was still alive, still burning with fever, but alive. Margaret forced herself to stand. Her legs barely worked. Her vision swam, but she stood anyway, and when she looked out of the cave, she saw something that made her heart skip. Smoke, thin and distant, but definitely smoke, which meant people, which meant shelter. She got Rhett onto the sled again and started walking. The smoke came from a ranch house. Margaret saw it from a ridge overlooking the valley, a sprawling building with barns and corrals and outbuildings scattered around it. Cattle dotted the snow-covered fields. Fence lines ran in neat rows. It was civilization, or at least the frontier version of it. Rhett stirred as they got closer. His eyes opened, unfocused, confused. Where? I don't know, Margaret said. Some ranch, saw smoke, needed shelter. Need to... Clara... His words were slurred, barely coherent. Later. First we get you somewhere warm. They made it to the ranch house just as the sun reached its peak. Margaret was beyond exhausted, running on nothing but will, and when the front door opened, she almost fell down the steps. A woman stood in the doorway, young, maybe 20, with dark hair, and Rhett's same strong jaw. Her eyes went wide when she saw them. Rhett? She was down the steps in an instant, grabbing her brother, and Margaret let go, let the woman take the weight. What happened? Who are you? Margaret Callahan. Found him shot. Been keeping him alive. The woman, Clara had to be, looked at Margaret properly for the first time. Saw the blood, the exhaustion, the way she could barely stand. Get inside, both of you, now. The ranch house was warm. That was Margaret's first thought. Warm and bright and full of the kind of comfort she'd forgotten existed. Clara shouted for help, and ranch hands appeared, lifting Rhett, carrying him to a bedroom, moving with the kind of efficiency that said they'd dealt with injuries before. Someone tried to help Margaret walk. She shook them off, followed Rhett to the bedroom, and didn't leave his side until she'd checked the wound herself. Made sure it was clean, made sure he was settled. Then her legs gave out and everything went dark. She woke up in a bed, a real bed, with clean sheets and a feather pillow and blankets that weren't falling apart. Sunlight streamed through a window. The smell of cooking food drifted from somewhere downstairs. For a moment, Margaret thought she was dreaming. Then the door opened and Clara came in carrying a tray. You're awake. Good. You need to eat. Rhett is alive, stable. The doctor came this morning and said whoever patched him up did an incredible job considering the circumstances. Clara set the tray on the bed. That was you, I'm guessing. Margaret nodded. You saved my brother's life. Maybe. Or maybe I just delayed the inevitable. Clara studied her for a long moment. He told me what happened. At your cabin. With Crow's men. Said you fought beside him. Said you could have run but didn't. Wasn't much choice in it. There's always a choice. Clara sat down on the edge of the bed. Rhett says you're a nurse. Says you're in some kind of trouble back east. Margaret's defenses went up immediately. What else did he say? Nothing. Just that you needed help and he owed you a debt. Clara paused. Look, I don't care what you did or didn't do before. Out here, the past is the past. What matters is what you do now. And what you did was save my brother when you could have let him die. That means something. He offered me a job before all this happened. The offer still stands. We need a nurse. The ranch hands are always getting hurt and Clara hesitated. I get sick sometimes. Bad sick. It would help to have someone who knows medicine nearby. Margaret looked at the food on the tray. Real bread, butter, eggs. More food than she'd seen in months. Her stomach was cramping just looking at it. Crow's men know I helped Rhett. They'll come here looking. Let them come. This is Dalton land. Has been for 20 years. We've got 15 ranch hands who'd die to protect it. Vernon Crow doesn't scare us." But Margaret could see the fear in Clara's eyes, hear it in the slight shake of her voice. Crow did scare her, scared everyone. And now Margaret had painted a target on her back by choosing the wrong side of a war she didn't understand. "I need to think about it," she said. "Fair enough. But while you're thinking, you're eating and resting, and not going anywhere until you're strong enough to stand without falling over." Clara left. Margaret stared at the food, then forced herself to eat slowly. Her stomach rebelled at first, cramping around the sudden richness, but she kept going. She needed her strength back, needed to be able to think clearly, needed to figure out what the hell she was going to do next. She found Rhett 2 days later. He was sitting up in bed, still pale but alert, when she knocked on his door. "Come in." Margaret entered. The room was bigger than her entire cabin had been, with a real fireplace and windows that looked out over the valley. Rhett watched her approach with eyes that were clear now, sharp, assessing. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I got shot and dragged through a blizzard. You?" "About the same." They looked at each other for a moment. Two people who'd survived something together, bound now by blood and violence and choices that couldn't be unmade. "Clara says Crow's men haven't come back," Rhett said finally. Yet, he agreed, "but they will. Vernon doesn't give up." "Tell me about him. About this war you're fighting." So Rhett told her. About the drought that had been killing the valley for 3 years. About how Vernon Crow had been buying up ranches one by one, forcing desperate families to sell, burning out the ones who wouldn't. About the water rights that Rhett's father had secured decades ago. Rights that gave Dalton Ranch access to the only reliable stream for 50 miles. "Without our water, the other ranches die," Rhett explained. "With it, they can survive. Crow wants control of that water, wants to own the whole valley, and I'm the only thing standing in his way." "So he sent men to kill you?" "Not the first time. Won't be the last." Margaret moved to the window, looking out at the ranch. She could see men working in the corrals, cattle moving through the fields, the kind of organized life she'd been missing for months. "Why haven't you sold?" she asked. "Taken the money and left?" "Because this is my home. My family's home. My father died protecting this land. I'm not handing it over to a man like Vernon Crow just because he's willing to kill for it. Even if staying means dying." Even then, Margaret turned back to face him. "That's stupid." "Maybe, but it's my kind of stupid." Rhett shifted in the bed, wincing. "You don't have to stay, Margaret. I know you came here because you had nowhere else to go. But this fight, it's not yours. You can leave whenever you want." "Can I? Crow's men saw my face. They know I helped you. Think they'll just let me walk away?" "I'll give you money. Enough to get far away from here. Start over somewhere they'll never find you." It was a generous offer. More than generous. Margaret should take it, should run as far and fast as she could before this war swallowed her whole. But she was so tired of running. "I'll stay," she heard herself say. "For now. Clara needs a nurse. And you're going to need someone to change those bandages until that wound heals properly." Rhett smiled. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I'm tired of hiding in cabins and waiting to die." "Fair enough." Margaret turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "One question. Was it worth it? Getting shot? Nearly dying? All of it. Was holding on to this ranch worth that?" Rhett was quiet for a long moment. "Ask me again when this is over." Margaret settled into ranch life the way water finds cracks in stone, slowly, inevitably, changing the shape of everything around her. The first week passed in a blur of checking Rhett's wound, treating ranch hands who'd been kicked by horses or cut on barbed wire, and trying not to think about the men who were probably still hunting them. Clara gave her a room on the second floor with a view of the valley, and Margaret spent the night staring out at the darkness, waiting for riders that didn't come. But they would. She knew they would. On the 8th day, Clara collapsed during breakfast. One moment she was pouring coffee, the next she was on the floor, her body convulsing, foam at the corners of her mouth. Margaret was beside her in seconds, turning her on her side, making sure she didn't swallow her tongue while the ranch hands stood frozen in the doorway. "Get out!" Margaret snapped at them. "Give her space. Someone find Rhett." The seizure lasted 90 seconds. When it passed, Clara lay gasping on the kitchen floor, her eyes unfocused, her skin clammy with sweat. "It's okay. Margaret said quietly, checking her pulse. You're okay. Just breathe. Happens sometimes, Clara managed. Her voice was slurred, weak. Since I was a kid. How often? Once a month, maybe less. I never know when. Rhett appeared in the doorway, still favoring his wounded side, his face pale with worry. Clara, I'm fine. But she wasn't fine. She was shaking, exhausted, looking like she'd just fought a battle inside her own body. Help me up! Between Margaret and Rhett, they got Clara to her room. Margaret stayed while Rhett paced the hallway outside, and when Clara finally fell asleep, Margaret found him sitting on the stairs with his head in his hands. How long has she been having seizures? Margaret asked. Since she was 12. Our mother had them too. Died during one when Clara was young. Has she seen a doctor? Every doctor within 100 miles. They all say the same thing. Nothing they can do. Just have to wait and hope she doesn't hurt herself when they happen. Rhett looked up, and Margaret saw the fear in his eyes. She's all I have left. My father's gone. My mother's gone. If something happens to Clara, nothing's going to happen to her. You don't know that. No, but I can watch her. Make sure she's not alone when it happens. Keep her safe. Margaret sat down beside him on the stairs. That's what you hired me for, isn't it? I hired you because I owed you my life. Same thing. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the ranch was coming alive with morning activity. Men shouting, cattle lowing, the sounds of a working operation. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. The kind Margaret had forgotten existed during those months alone in the mountains. Vernon Crow came by yesterday, Rhett said finally. Margaret's stomach tightened. What? Rode up to the front gate with 6 men. Wanted to talk business. Said he heard I was back from the dead and thought we should discuss terms. What did you tell him? Told him to get off my land before I shot him for trespassing. That was smart. It was stupid. He knows I'm wounded, knows I'm vulnerable. He's going to push harder now. So what do we do? Rhett looked at her. We? You said this fight wasn't mine. Maybe it wasn't, but those men tried to kill me too. So yeah, we. Something shifted in Rhett's expression. Gratitude maybe, or surprise, or something deeper that neither of them was ready to name yet. There's a ranchers' meeting next week, he said. In town. Everyone who still owns land in the valley will be there. If I can convince them to stand together, form a water alliance, we might have a chance against Crow. And if they won't, then we're alone. And Vernon Crow gets what he wants. The meeting was set for Saturday. Margaret spent the days leading up to it learning the rhythm of the ranch, treating the steady stream of injuries that came with working around animals and machinery and hard men doing dangerous work. She cleaned cuts, set a broken finger, lanced an infected wound on a cowboy's leg that he'd been ignoring for 2 weeks because he was too tough to complain. You're good at this, one of the ranch hands told her. His name was Billy, young kid with a crooked nose and an easy smile. Better than old Doc Henderson in town. He just throws whiskey at everything and hopes it works. Whiskey works more often than you'd think, Margaret said, wrapping the bandage. But keep it clean. Change the dressing every day. If you see red streaks spreading from the wound, find me immediately. Yes, ma'am. Word spread fast. By the end of the week, ranch hands from neighboring properties were showing up with injuries they'd been living with for months. A man with a shoulder that had been dislocated and healed wrong. A woman whose baby had been breech and left her with complications. Kids with fevers, old men with coughs that wouldn't quit. Margaret treated them all in an old storage shed that Clara helped her convert into a makeshift clinic. It wasn't much. A table, some shelves, a wood stove for sterilizing instruments, but it was more than she'd had in that frozen cabin, and every person she helped felt like reclaiming a piece of herself she'd thought was lost forever. Clara watched from the doorway one afternoon, leaning against the frame while Margaret stitched up a ranch hand who'd been gored by a bull. You're changing things here, Clara said when the man had left. People are starting to trust again, starting to hope. I'm just doing my job. It's more than that. You're giving them something to believe in. Margaret cleaned her instruments in boiling water, not looking at Clara. I'm not a saint. Don't make me into one. I'm not, but you're not the broken thing you think you are either. That hit harder than Margaret wanted to admit. She'd spent so long thinking of herself as ruined, as someone the world had finished with, that hearing anything different felt wrong, dangerous, like hope was just another thing that could be taken away. "Your brother's going to get himself killed," Margaret said, changing the subject. "You know that, right?" "Probably." "And you're okay with it?" Clara came into the clinic, pulled up a stool, sat down across from Margaret. "No, I'm terrified. Every day I wake up wondering if this is the day Vernon Crow sends more men, if this is the day I lose Rhett the way I lost our parents." She paused. "But I also know my brother, know he'd rather die fighting than live on his knees, so I stand beside him and hope it's enough." "What if it's not?" "Then at least we went down together." Saturday came gray and cold. Rhett insisted on riding into town despite Margaret's protests that his wound wasn't healed enough for that kind of strain. Clara went with him, and after arguing herself hoarse, Margaret climbed into the wagon too. "You don't have to come," Rhett said. "Someone needs to patch you up when you tear your stitches." "Always so optimistic. I prefer realistic." The ride to town took 2 hours. Margaret watched the landscape change from ranch land to scattered homesteads to the cluster of buildings that passed for civilization out here. A general store, a saloon, a church, a livery stable, and a meeting hall that looked like it had been built from whatever lumber was left over from everything else. The hall was already packed when they arrived. Ranchers, farmers, their wives and children, all crammed into a space that was too small and too hot despite the cold outside. The air smelled like sweat and tobacco and fear. Vernon Crow was there. Margaret recognized him immediately. A big man in expensive clothes, silver hair, a face that looked friendly until you saw the eyes. Cold eyes. The kind that calculated profit and loss in human lives. He was surrounded by men in suits, lawyers probably, and more men in gun belts who definitely weren't lawyers. He smiled when he saw Rhett. "Dalton, heard you were dead. Shame the rumors were wrong." "Vernon." Rhett's voice was flat, emotionless. "Didn't know this was your meeting." "It's everyone's meeting. We're all trying to survive out here. Thought we should discuss how to do that together." "By letting you buy everyone out at half what their land is worth?" Crow's smile didn't waver. "By being reasonable. Practical. The drought's killing us all. Some of us have the resources to weather it, others don't. I'm just offering those others a way out before they lose everything." "You're offering them slavery with a smile." The room had gone quiet. Everyone watching, waiting to see what would happen. "That's a harsh word," Crow said. "I prefer partnership. Call it whatever you want. The answer's still no." Crow's eyes shifted to Margaret, standing behind Rhett. His expression didn't change, but she saw the recognition there, saw him filing away her presence, calculating what it meant. "And who's this? New hire?" "None of your business. Everything in this valley is my business, Dalton. You'd do well to remember that." The meeting started before things could escalate. A local rancher named Morrison stood at the front calling for order, laying out the situation. The drought, the dying cattle, the failing crops, the desperation that hung over everyone like a noose waiting to drop. Then Crow stood and made his pitch. He was good. Margaret had to give him that. He painted himself as a savior, someone who could bring resources and capital and stability to a valley that was falling apart. He talked about irrigation systems and new wells and cooperative ventures that would save everyone. He made it sound reasonable, even generous, and people were listening. Margaret could see it in their faces. The hope, the temptation, the exhaustion of fighting a losing battle against nature and economics and time. Then Rhett stood. "Everything Vernon just said is a lie." The room erupted, people shouting, arguing, some agreeing with Rhett, and some telling him to sit down and shut up. Morrison banged his gavel. "Let the man speak!" Rhett moved to the front, favoring his wounded side, his face pale, but his voice steady. "I know you're all scared. I know you're tired, but selling to Vernon Crow isn't salvation. It's suicide." "That's slander," one of Crow's lawyers said. "It's truth. My father kept records, bills of sale from ranchers who sold to Crow 5 years ago. You know what happened to those families? They got paid half what was promised, forced to work their own land as hired hands. Some of them disappeared entirely when they complained too loud." "You have proof of these accusations?" Crow asked. His voice was still friendly, but the eyes had gone dead. I have my father's records, legal documents showing water rights that belong to the Dalton Ranch, rights that extend to anyone who wants to form a cooperative alliance. We don't need Vernon Crow's money. We need each other. Margaret watched the room divide in real time. Some people leaning forward, interested, others shaking their heads, unwilling to take the risk. Crow's men spreading out along the walls, hands near their guns. "This is insane," someone shouted. "We can't fight Vernon Crow." "We can if we stand together," Rhett said. "And if we don't? What then? You going to protect us when his men come burning our homes?" "Yes." The simplicity of it cut through the noise. Rhett standing there, wounded and outnumbered but unbreaking, promising protection he might not be able to deliver. "I know what I'm asking," Rhett continued. "I know it's dangerous. But if we give in now, we lose everything. Our land, our freedom, our future. Is that really what you want? To spend the rest of your lives working for a man like Vernon Crow?" The room was silent again. Margaret could see the calculation happening on every face. Fear versus hope. Safety versus freedom. Then a woman stood, old, weathered, the kind who'd survived everything the frontier could throw at her and kept going anyway. "I'm with Dalton," she said. "My husband built our ranch with his own hands before the drought killed him. I'm not handing it over to some snake in a fancy suit." Another rancher stood. Then another. Not everyone. Not even half. But enough that the room shifted, the balance tipping towards something that might have been courage or might have been collective suicide. Crow's friendly mask slipped for just a second. Margaret saw the rage underneath, the calculation, the promise of violence. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "All of you." "Maybe," Rhett said, "but it's our mistake to make." The meeting fell apart after that. People arguing, splitting into factions, some leaving immediately while others clustered around Rhett asking questions about water rights and protection and what the hell they were supposed to do next. Crow left with his entourage, but not before stopping beside Margaret. "You're the one from the cabin," he said. Not a question. Margaret met his eyes and didn't flinch. "I am." "Unfortunate business. My men tell me you fought back. Hurt one of them pretty badly." "He shouldn't have broken into my home." Crow smiled. It was worse than the rage had been. "This valley is going to burn, Miss Callahan. Miss Callahan. And when it does, I want you to remember that you could have walked away. Could have stayed in your little cabin and let events take their course. But you chose to stand with Dalton. That makes you part of this now. And that means when the fire comes, you burn too." He left before Margaret could respond, left her standing there with her heart pounding and her hands shaking and the absolute certainty that she'd just made herself a target. Clara appeared at her elbow. "That was Vernon Crow." "I figured. He just threatened you." "I noticed." "You don't seem very worried." Margaret thought about Boston, about the Hartford family and their lawyers and their power, about how she'd run then, how running had saved her life but destroyed everything else. "I'm tired of being scared," she said. The ride back to the ranch was tense. Rhett drove the wagon while Clara sat beside him, and Margaret rode in the back watching the road behind them for riders who didn't come. Not yet. "You did good today," Clara told her brother. "Did I?" Half the room walked out. Vernon's going to come after the ones who stayed with us twice as hard now. But they stayed. That's something. It's a target. We painted a target on everyone who stood up. Then we protect them. Rhett laughed, bitter and tired. "With what? 15 ranch hands and hope? Vernon has money, men, connections. We have water rights and stubbornness." "You have me," Margaret said from the back of the wagon. They both turned to look at her. "I'm a nurse. I can treat injuries when this gets violent, can teach people basic field medicine so they can help each other. It's not much, but it's something." "Margaret, don't tell me I don't have to do this. I'm already in it." Crow made that clear. "So either I help or I hide. And I'm done hiding." Something passed between them. Understanding maybe, or the kind of bond that forms when people choose to stand together knowing they might fall together too. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She stood at her window watching the valley, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, all the ways people could die, all the ways she could fail again. A knock on her door made her turn. Rhett stood in the hallway, still dressed, looking like he hadn't slept either. "Can I come in?" Margaret nodded, stepping back to let him enter. He closed the door behind him, moved to the window, stood beside her looking out at the same darkness. "I need to show you something," he said finally. He led her downstairs to his father's study, unlocked a drawer and pulled out a leather folder stuffed with documents, spread them across the desk. "These are the records I mentioned. Water rights, bills of sale, testimonies from families Crow destroyed." He looked at her. "If something happens to me, these need to get to the federal marshal in Denver. They're the only proof we have that Crow's been breaking the law. Nothing's going to happen to you." "You don't know that?" "Neither do I. But if it does, someone needs to know where these are. Someone I trust." Margaret looked at the documents, saw names and dates, and the kind of detailed record-keeping that could bring down an empire if the right people saw it. "Why me?" "Because you're not from here. You have no stake in this valley except the one you chose. That makes you more trustworthy than anyone who's lived here their whole life. Or more likely to run when things get bad. You didn't run from my cabin when Crow's men came. Didn't run when I offered you money to leave. You're still here. That tells me everything I need to know." He was standing close now, close enough that Margaret could see the exhaustion in his face, the pain he was hiding from everyone else, the fear he wouldn't admit to. "We're going to lose," she said quietly. "You know that, right? Vernon Crow has too much power, too many resources. We're going to lose and people are going to die." "Probably. So why fight?" Rhett was quiet for a long moment. "You asked me before if holding on to this ranch was worth getting shot, worth nearly dying. I didn't have an answer then. And now? Now I think maybe it's not about the ranch. It's about not letting men like Vernon Crow decide who gets to exist and who doesn't. It's about standing up even when you know you'll fall. Because if we don't, then what's the point of any of it?" Margaret understood that, had lived with that same question during those months alone in the cabin. What's the point of surviving if you're not really alive? "I'm scared," she admitted. The words felt wrong coming out, like a weakness she shouldn't show. "Me too." "But you're still fighting." "So are you." They stood there in the study surrounded by documents that might save them or might just be evidence left behind when they were gone. Outside, the wind picked up, making the house creak and settle. Margaret's hand found Rhett's. She wasn't sure who reached first, but suddenly they were holding on to each other like drowning people, clinging to wreckage. "We should get some sleep," Rhett said, but he didn't move. "We should." Neither of them moved. Then Rhett's other hand came up, touched her face, and Margaret was kissing him before she could think about whether it was smart or stupid or a terrible idea. He kissed her back, careful of his wound, and for a few seconds the fear disappeared into something else entirely. They broke apart, breathing hard. "That was stupid," Margaret finished. "I was going to say complicated." Same thing. But Rhett was smiling, a real smile, not the tired half version he'd been wearing since she found him in the snow. "When this is over, when we're not fighting for our lives every day, I'd like to do that again, properly." "You think we'll survive long enough for proper?" "I'd like to try." Margaret thought about all the reasons this was a bad idea. She was running from her past. He was fighting a war he'd probably lose. They barely knew each other outside of violence and survival. But she was also thinking about how his hand felt in hers, how the kiss had made her feel something other than afraid for the first time in months. "Okay," she said, "let's try." The attack came 3 days later. Margaret was in the clinic treating a ranch hand's infected tooth when she heard the first gunshot, then shouting, then the sound of horses moving fast. She ran to the door, saw smoke rising from one of the barns, saw riders spreading out across the ranch property, torches in hand. 6 of them, maybe more. Crow's men, come to make good on their promise. The ranch hands were already fighting back. Gunfire erupted from the bunkhouse, from behind fence lines, from the main house where Clara was firing a rifle from an upstairs window. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and within minutes the second barn was burning too. Margaret ran toward the main house, keeping low, dodging between buildings. A bullet whined past her head, close enough that she felt the air move. She hit the ground, crawled the last 20 feet, and crashed through the door just as more shots tore through the windows. Rhett was there, reloading his rifle with hands that shook. Blood was spreading across his shirt. The wound had opened again. "Where's Clara?" Margaret shouted over the gunfire. Upstairs, covering the north side. You're bleeding. I noticed. Little busy right now. More gunfire, the sound of glass shattering. One of the ranch hands screaming outside, the sound cutting off abruptly. Margaret grabbed Rhett's medical kit from the shelf where she'd insisted he keep one. Sit down. We're under attack, and you'll bleed out before it's over if you don't let me work. Sit down. He sat. Margaret tore open his shirt, saw the wound had torn along half its length, fresh blood pouring out. She packed it with cloth, bound it tight, and prayed it would hold. Outside, the attack was getting worse. The raiders had set fire to the grain storage, to the equipment shed, to anything that would burn. Smoke was filling the air, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. Then Clara screamed from upstairs. Rhett was on his feet immediately, rifle in hand, taking the stairs two at a time with Margaret right behind him. They found Clara on the floor of her bedroom, her body convulsing, foam at her mouth. A seizure, in the middle of a battle. Cover me, Margaret told Rhett, dropping beside Clara. Rhett moved to the window, firing at shapes moving through the smoke, while Margaret turned Clara on her side, checked her airway, held her head so she wouldn't crack it against the floor. The seizure lasted forever, and no time at all. When it passed, Clara lay gasping, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry. I couldn't help it. It's okay. You're okay. Margaret checked her pulse, her pupils. Can you stand? I think so. They got Clara to her feet just as a rider appeared at the window. Rhett fired, missed, fired again. The rider went down. We can't stay here, Margaret said. The whole ranch is going to burn. Where do we go? Good question. Outside was a war zone. Inside was a trap, and Clara was in no condition to run. Then Margaret heard it. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses. Coming from the east road. More of Crow's men, or something else. The riders that appeared weren't Crows. They were ranchers. The families who'd stood with Rhett at the meeting come to help defend Dalton Ranch the way Rhett had promised to defend them. The tide turned fast. Crow's raiders found themselves suddenly outnumbered, outflanked, caught between the ranch hands and the reinforcements. They broke, scattered, fled into the smoke with half their number dead or wounded behind them. When the shooting finally stopped, Margaret stepped outside and saw the cost. 2 barns gone, the grain storage destroyed, 3 ranch hands dead, 5 more wounded, the ranch property torn apart by bullets and fire and violence. But they'd survived. Margaret moved through the wounded, treating what she could, marking the ones who needed a real doctor, holding the hand of a young cowboy who was dying and knew it. Did we win? He asked her. Margaret looked around at the destruction, at the bodies, at the smoke still rising into the gray sky. Yeah, she lied. We won. The young cowboy died just before sunrise. Margaret closed his eyes and stood up with blood on her hands and exhaustion so deep it felt like drowning. Around her, the ranch was a graveyard of smoke and ash. The surviving ranch hands moved through the wreckage in silence, putting out fires, counting bodies, trying to salvage what little remained. Rhett found her standing by the burned-out grain storage, staring at nothing. You should rest, he said. So should you. His shirt was soaked through with blood again. The bandage she'd applied during the fight had failed hours ago. Come on, let me fix that before you collapse. They went to what was left of the clinic. Half the roof had caved in from a stray torch, but the medical supplies were intact. Margaret cleaned Rhett's wound for what felt like the 100th time, her hands moving automatically while her brain refused to think about anything at all. This has to be stitched properly, she said. Not field medicine, real surgery. Can you do it? Not here. Not with what I have. Margaret looked around at the destroyed clinic. We need to get you to town, to a real doctor. Can't leave. Crow will attack again the moment he knows I'm gone. Then you'll die here. That wound keeps tearing open. Eventually it's going to tear something vital and no amount of bandages will save you. They stared at each other, both too stubborn to back down, both too tired to keep fighting. Clara appeared in the doorway. She looked worse than both of them, pale, shaking, guilt written all over her face. It's my fault, she said quietly. The seizure? If I hadn't... Stop. Rhett's voice was sharp. Don't do that. Don't blame yourself for something you can't control. People died because I couldn't fight. People died because Vernon Crow is a bastard who burns ranches, when he doesn't get his way. That's on him, not you." But Clara's face said she didn't believe it. Margaret recognized that look, had seen it in the mirror enough times, the weight of blame you carry whether you deserve it or not. "The ranchers are outside," Clara said, changing the subject. "Morrison and the others who came to help. They want to talk." The ranchers had gathered in front of what used to be the main barn. 12 of them, soot-covered and exhausted, some wounded, all looking like they'd just seen the future and didn't like what they found there. Morrison spoke first. He was the old rancher who'd run the meeting in town, a man who'd survived 40 years on the frontier and probably thought he'd seen everything. "This was a warning," he said. "Crow's telling us what happens if we don't fall in line."
"And what do you want to do about it?" Rhett asked. "That depends. You promised us protection. 3 of my men got shot tonight defending your ranch. I need to know if this alliance is worth dying for. Is keeping your land worth dying for? Don't turn this around. I asked you a question." Rhett was quiet for a moment. Margaret could see him calculating, weighing his words, knowing that what he said next would either hold this fragile alliance together or shatter it completely. "I can't promise you won't get hurt," Rhett said finally. "Can't promise Crow won't come after you next. But I can promise that if we stand together, we have a chance. Alone, we're dead. All of us. Our ranches burned, our families scattered, our land owned by a man who'll bleed it dry and throw away the husk. That's not much of a promise. It's the only one I have." Morrison looked at the other ranchers. Some nodded, others looked away. The old woman who'd been first to stand at the meeting spoke up. "I didn't come here to quit," she said. "Lost my husband to this drought, lost half my cattle, but I'll be damned if I lose my land too. I'm staying with Dalton, even if it means more nights like this. Especially then, because running just means dying slower." One by one, the others agreed. Not all of them. 2 ranchers left immediately, taking their men and their loyalty with them. But the rest stayed and started planning. They worked through the morning. Margaret moved between groups, treating injuries, listening to men argue about patrol schedules and defensive positions, and how to protect multiple ranches when they barely had enough people to protect one. She found Rhett alone behind the burned barn, sitting on a piece of scorched timber with his head in his hands. "You did good," she said. "I got people killed." "Crow got people killed. You're trying to save them." Same result. Margaret sat down beside him. Her whole body ached. She couldn't remember the last time she'd slept more than an hour at a stretch. But sitting here next to Rhett, watching the sun climb over the destroyed ranch, she felt something that might have been peace, or maybe just exhaustion so deep it looked like peace. "When this is over," Rhett said quietly, "if we survive it, I want to take you somewhere that isn't burning or bleeding or fighting." "Where?" "I don't know. Somewhere quiet, where we can just be normal for a while." "I don't think I remember how to be normal." "Then we'll figure it out together." Margaret leaned against his shoulder, felt him tense, then relax, then carefully put his arm around her despite the pain it caused his wound. "That thing you said," she told him, "about doing this properly when the war is over." "Yeah? I'd like that." They sat like that until Clara called them back to deal with the next crisis, and the next, and the next, because the war wasn't over and proper was still a long way off. The federal marshal arrived 3 days later. Margaret was in what was left of the clinic when she heard horses approaching. Her first instinct was to grab a weapon, but these riders came from the East Road flying official colors. 5 men in federal uniforms led by a marshal whose badge caught the sunlight. His name was Thomas Garrett, and he looked like someone who'd spent too long seeing the worst of people and was tired of it. "I'm looking for Rhett Dalton," he said. Rhett appeared from the house, Clara and Margaret flanking him. The marshal's eyes moved over the destroyed ranch, taking inventory of the damage, the bullet holes, the burned buildings. "Heard you had some trouble out here." "You could say that. Want to tell me what happened?" So Rhett told him about Vernon Crow's attempted takeover, about the ranchers who'd sold out under pressure or force, about the attack 3 nights ago that left 3 men dead and half the ranch destroyed. Garrett listened without interrupting, his expression giving nothing away. When Rhett finished, the marshal was quiet for a long moment. "You have proof of any of this?" "I have my father's records, bills of sale, testimonies,
Water rights documentation. I'll need to see them. They went to Rhett's study. Margaret followed, watching as Rhett spread out the documents his father had spent years collecting. Evidence of fraud, coercion, violence, names and dates, and the kind of detailed record-keeping that should have been enough to bring down Vernon Crowe years ago. Garrett studied the papers carefully, read through testimonies, checked dates against official records. His face remained neutral, but Margaret saw something shift in his eyes. "This is good work," he said finally. "Thorough, but it's not enough." "What do you mean it's not enough?" Clara's voice was sharp. "It's right there. Everything Crowe's done—" "I believe you, but believing and proving in a court of law are different things. Most of these testimonies are from people who've since disappeared or died. The bills of sale could be forgeries. A good lawyer, and Crowe has the best lawyers, would tear this apart in an hour." "So what are you saying?" Rhett asked. "That we're on our own?" "I'm saying I need more. Hard evidence. Something that ties Crowe directly to criminal activity. Attempted murder. Arson. Bribery of officials." Garrett looked at them. "You give me that, and I can move against him. Without it, my hands are tied." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. They'd survived an attack, lost good people, fought and bled and nearly died. And it still wasn't enough. "There might be a way," she heard herself say. Everyone turned to look at her. "Crowe came to the ranchers' meeting, threatened me directly afterward, said the valley was going to burn and I'd burn with it." Margaret's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. "That's a threat. If we can get him to make more threats, more explicit ones, in front of witnesses—" "That's dangerous," Garrett said. "Everything about this is dangerous." "She's right." Rhett was looking at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. "If we can draw Crowe out, get him to incriminate himself—" "You'll get yourself killed," Clara interrupted. "Both of you. This is insane." "It's the only option we have." The marshal pulled out a notebook, started writing. "If you're serious about this, I can help. Set up a meeting. Bring deputies as witnesses. But you understand the risk. Crowe isn't stupid. He smells a trap. This whole thing falls apart." "Then we make sure he doesn't smell a trap," Margaret said. They planned it over the next 2 days. A meeting in town, ostensibly to negotiate a truce. Crowe would come because his ego wouldn't let him pass up the chance to gloat. Garrett would position his deputies around the meeting hall, hidden but close enough to hear everything. And Margaret would be the bait. "I don't like this," Rhett said the night before the meeting. They were in his study again, going over the plan for the 10th time. "Using you as bait. It's my choice." "It's a bad choice." "Maybe. But it's mine to make." Margaret looked at the documents spread across the desk. Her whole life had been other people making choices for her. The Hartford family, the lawyers, the scandal that destroyed her career. "I'm tired of being a victim, tired of running. This is me standing and fighting." "What if something goes wrong?" "Then at least I went down swinging instead of hiding in a cabin, waiting to freeze." Rhett pulled her close, careful of his healing wound. They'd been doing this more often, finding excuses to touch, to be near each other, building something fragile in the middle of chaos. "When this is over," he said against her hair, "I'm taking you somewhere nice, somewhere with actual beds and food that isn't jerky." "That sounds like heaven." "It's a promise." Margaret tilted her head back, kissed him properly this time. Not the desperate kiss from before, but something slower, deeper. A promise of their own that they'd survive this, that there would be an after. Clara cleared her throat from the doorway. "Sorry to interrupt, but we have a problem." The problem arrived on horseback an hour later. A young man, maybe 25, dressed in expensive clothes that had seen hard travel. He dismounted in front of the house and stood there looking lost. Rhett came out with his rifle. "You're on private property." "I know. I'm looking for Rhett Dalton." "You found him. Who are you?" The young man took off his hat. In the lamplight from the house, Margaret could see the resemblance immediately. Same eyes as Vernon Crowe, same jaw. But where Vernon looked cold and calculating, this man just looked broken. "My name is Elias Crowe. I'm Vernon's son, and I need your help." The silence that followed was absolute. Rhett's rifle came up. Clara appeared in the doorway with her own weapon. Margaret's hand moved to the revolver she'd started carrying after the attack. "You've got 3 seconds to explain why I shouldn't shoot you," Rhett said. Because I'm not my father. Elias's voice shook. Because I'm tired of watching him destroy people. Because I have proof of everything he's done, and I'm willing to testify against him. Why? Because he killed my mother. Elias's composure cracked, his voice breaking. Everyone thinks she died in an accident, a riding fall. But I found letters. She was going to leave him, going to expose his business dealings. And 3 days later, she was dead. You have proof of this? Garrett stepped out of the shadows where he'd been waiting. The marshal had insisted on staying at the ranch until the meeting, just in case. Letters, financial records, a ledger my father kept of every bribe, every illegal deal, every person he had threatened or hurt. Elias reached into his saddlebag slowly, pulled out a leather portfolio. It's all here. Everything you need to put him away for the rest of his life. Garrett took the portfolio, opened it, started reading. His expression remained neutral, but his hands moved faster, flipping pages, checking documents. This is real, he said finally. This is everything we needed. Why now? Margaret asked. Why turn on him now? Elias looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. Because last week he told me to kill someone. A rancher who wouldn't sell. Said it was time I proved myself. That if I wanted to inherit his empire, I needed to show I had the stomach for what it takes. He paused. I don't want his empire. I don't want any of it. I just want it to stop. Rhett lowered his rifle slowly. If you're lying, I'm not. I swear I'm not. They brought Elias inside, sat him down, let him tell his story while Garrett documented everything, asked questions, verified facts. It took hours. By the time they finished, dawn was breaking over the valley. Garrett closed his notebook. This changes everything. With this evidence and Elias's testimony, we can arrest Vernon Crow today. End this without the meeting, without putting anyone else at risk. Margaret should have felt relief, should have felt the weight lifting, but all she felt was hollow, like she'd been bracing for a fight that suddenly wasn't coming. What happens to Elias? She asked. Witness protection. New identity. He'll have to disappear for a while, but he'll be safe. Elias laughed bitterly. Safe? Right. Because people who cross Vernon Crow are always safe. Your father will be in federal prison, Garrett said. He can't hurt you from there. You don't know him. He has connections, money, power. Even locked up, he'll find a way. Then you make sure the trial puts him away for life. Make sure your testimony is so solid there's no chance of appeal. Rhett sat down across from Elias. You want to stop your father? That's how. Not by hiding, by standing in a courtroom and telling the truth. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Okay, I'll do it. Garrett left at sunrise with 4 deputies and enough evidence to arrest Vernon Crow before noon. They took Elias with them for his own protection. Margaret watched them ride away and felt the strangest sense of anticlimax. That's it? Clara said beside her. It's over? Maybe. Or maybe Crow has one more move left. But the hours passed and no riders appeared. No gunshots, no fires. Just silence and the sound of ranch hands rebuilding what had been destroyed. The news reached them by evening. Vernon Crow had been arrested at his ranch, hadn't fought back, hadn't resisted, just let the deputies put him in irons and take him away while his hired men watched and did nothing. The valley exhaled. Margaret found Rhett in the barn, feeding the horses. He looked tired but lighter somehow, like a weight he'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. It's really over, he said. Looks like it. I don't know what to do now. I've been fighting Crow for so long, I forgot what it's like to just live. Margaret leaned against the stall door. I know the feeling. What are you going to do, now that you don't have to hide anymore? Good question. Margaret had been running for so long she didn't know who she was when she wasn't scared. Didn't know what her life looked like without fear driving every decision. I thought I might stay, she said. If the offer's still open, the valley needs a nurse, and I'm tired of being alone. Rhett turned to look at her. The offer's open. Will always be open. Even after everything? Especially after everything. He crossed the barn, stopped in front of her. You saved my life, fought beside me, helped save this valley. You think I'd let you leave now? You might not have a choice. I'm difficult, stubborn. I have nightmares about Boston and a past that won't stay buried. Good. I'm difficult too, and stubborn. And I have a ranch that's half destroyed and a valley full of people who expect me to lead them even though I'm making this up as I go. He took her hands. Sounds like we're a perfect match. Margaret laughed. Actually laughed. The sound felt foreign, like something she'd forgotten how to do. You're serious about this? About us? I've been serious since you cut a bullet out of me with a kitchen knife and told me not to die on you. Everything after that was just me figuring out what I already knew. Which is that you're it for me. That I want to wake up next to you, want to build something with you, want to fight with you and make up with you and grow old annoying each other. He paused. If that's what you want too. Margaret thought about the cabin in the mountains, about hiding and starving and waiting to die. Thought about the life she'd lost in Boston, the person she used to be before the world broke her. Then she thought about this, standing in a barn with a man who'd seen her at her worst and wanted her anyway, a valley that needed her, a purpose that felt real. Yes, she said, that's what I want too. Rhett kissed her then, properly, without the fear of bullets or fire or death hanging over them. Just two people who'd survived hell together and come out the other side still standing. The wedding happened 6 months later. By then, the ranch had been rebuilt, the burned barns replaced, the valley recovering under a water cooperative that shared resources instead of hoarding them. Margaret's clinic had grown from a shed to a proper building with real medical equipment and enough supplies to handle anything short of major surgery. She stood in front of the ranch house wearing a dress Clara had insisted on buying, watching ranchers and their families gather under cottonwood trees beside the stream they'd fought so hard to protect. The same stream that had been at the center of Vernon Crow's war. Crow himself was serving 20 years in federal prison. Elias had testified against him, and the trial had been brutal and public and thorough. The man who'd terrorized the valley was gone, his empire dismantled, his power broken. Clara appeared at Margaret's elbow. You ready? No. Good. That means it's real. They walked together to where Rhett stood waiting. He was wearing his best clothes, his wound now just a scar hidden beneath his shirt. A reminder of how this all started, how close they'd both come to dying before they ever really lived. The ceremony was simple, no fancy words, just promises made in front of people who'd fought beside them, who'd survived the same hell, who understood what it meant to choose each other after everything they'd been through. When it was done, when they were officially married, Rhett pulled Margaret close and whispered in her ear, "Told you I'd take you somewhere nice." Margaret looked around at the ranch, at the valley, at the people celebrating around them. Not nice in the way Boston had been nice, with its fancy balls and social rules and carefully maintained appearances. But real. Honest. Home. Yeah, she said. You did. That night, lying in bed beside her husband, the words still felt strange. Margaret thought about the woman she'd been when this started. Broken. Hiding. Convinced the world had finished with her. She'd been wrong. The world hadn't finished with her. It had just been waiting for her to find the place where she belonged. The fight that mattered. The people worth standing beside. Rhett stirred beside her, pulled her closer without waking. Outside, wolves howled in the mountains. The same mountains where she'd found him dying in the snow, where she'd made a choice that changed everything. Margaret closed her eyes and slept without nightmares for the first time in years. The nightmares didn't stop just because Vernon Crow was in prison. Margaret woke 3 weeks after the wedding with her heart pounding, Rhett's hand on her shoulder, and the lingering image of fire consuming everything she'd built. She sat up in bed, breathing hard, trying to remember that the ranch was safe, that the war was over, that she was allowed to stop fighting now. Same one? Rhett asked quietly. Yeah. Want to talk about it? No. He pulled her back down anyway, held her until her breathing steadied. They'd developed this routine in the short time they'd been married. Margaret would wake, panicked. Rhett would anchor her back to reality. Neither of them mentioned it in daylight. Some wounds didn't heal just because you wanted them to. Morning came gray and cold. Margaret dressed and went to the clinic, where a line of people was already waiting. A pregnant woman worried about bleeding. A ranch hand with a cough that wouldn't quit. A child who'd burned her hand on a stove. Normal injuries, normal problems. The kind Margaret could actually fix. She worked through the morning, treating patients, dispensing medicine, trying not to think about the dream, trying not to think about how fragile everything they'd built actually was. Clara found her around noon carrying a basket of food.
You forgot to eat again. I wasn't hungry.
You're never hungry. Eat anyway. Clara set the basket on the examination table. We got a letter from Marshal Garrett. Crow's appeal was denied. He's staying in prison for the full 20 years. Margaret should have felt relief, should have felt safe. But all she felt was the waiting, the certainty that something else was coming.
You okay? Clara asked.
Fine.
You're a terrible liar.
Margaret sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted.
I keep waiting for it to fall apart, for Crow to find a way out, for someone else to come after the ranch, for everything we fought for to disappear. That's not going to happen.
You don't know that. Clara pulled up a stool, sat across from her. No, I don't. But I know my brother married a woman who survived Boston society, 6 months alone in the mountains, and a war with Vernon Crow. If something else comes, you'll survive that too. What if I don't want to survive anymore? What if I just want to live without constantly waiting for the next disaster? Then you practice. Every day you wake up and nothing terrible happens. That's practice. Eventually your brain catches up. Margaret wanted to believe that. Wanted to think healing was just a matter of time and repetition. But the nightmares suggested otherwise. She was still thinking about it that evening when a rider appeared on the east road. Everyone at the ranch went tense immediately, old habits from the war, but the rider was flying official colors. Another marshal, younger than Garrett, with news from Denver. Mrs. Dalton? He asked when Margaret came to the door. The title still felt strange. Yes. I have a message from the federal courthouse. Vernon Crow has requested to see you. The world tilted sideways. What? He's allowed 1 visitor per month. He's used this month's request to ask for you specifically. Tell him no. Ma'am, I'm just the messenger. You're under no obligation to go, but he was very insistent, said he had information you'd want to hear. Rhett appeared behind Margaret, his hand on her shoulder. What kind of information? He wouldn't say, just that it concerns Mrs. Dalton directly. After the marshal left, Margaret and Rhett stood in the doorway watching the sun set over the valley. The same valley that was finally at peace, finally rebuilding, finally breathing. You're not going, Rhett said. I know. He's playing games, trying to get in your head. I know that too. But Margaret was already thinking about it, about what Crow could possibly have to say, about the loose ends she'd been trying not to think about Boston and the Hartford family, and the scandal that destroyed her life. She went to Denver 3 days later, despite every rational voice in her head screaming not to. Rhett wanted to come with her, but she needed to do this alone. Needed to face whatever Crow had waiting without anyone else getting dragged into it. The federal prison was a stone fortress on the edge of the city. Guards searched her, took her weapons, led her through corridors that smelled like rust and despair. They put her in a room with bars on the windows and a table bolted to the floor. Vernon Crow entered 5 minutes later. He looked smaller than Margaret remembered. Thinner. Prison grays instead of expensive suits. But the eyes were the same, cold, calculating, completely unrepentant. Mrs. Dalton, he said, sitting down across from her. Thank you for coming. I didn't come to be polite. You have 5 minutes. Talk. Crow smiled. Direct. I appreciate that. Very well. I'll be equally direct. I know who you are, Margaret Callahan. I know what happened in Boston. I know about Rebecca Hartford and the surgery that went wrong. I know you took the blame for a drunk surgeon and ran before they could prosecute you. Margaret's blood went cold. Holly! I have resources even in prison, connections, friends who owe me favors. He leaned forward. The Hartford family never stopped looking for you. They want justice for their daughter, and I know exactly where you are. You're threatening me. I'm offering you a deal. Drop your testimony against me at my appeal hearing next month, and I'll make sure the Hartfords never find you. Keep testifying, and I'll send them a letter with your exact location. Margaret's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on the table, refusing to let him see how badly he'd rattled her. You're bluffing. You're in prison. You have no power. Don't I? My son betrayed me. My empire is gone. But I can still destroy you. Can still make sure you lose everything you've built out here. Your clinic, your marriage, your new life. His smile widened. All it takes is one letter. I could tell the marshals about this threat. Go ahead. They'll search my cell, find nothing,
and chalk it up to the word of a convicted criminal against a respectable woman. Meanwhile, my associates on the outside will send that letter anyway. Margaret stood up. We're done here. Think about it, Mrs. Dalton. Think about whether testifying against me is worth losing everything. You have 3 weeks to decide.
The guard escorted her out. Margaret made it to the street before her legs gave out. She sat on the steps of the prison shaking, trying to breathe, trying to think through the panic. Crow was right. If the Hartfords found her, they'd destroy her all over again. They had money, power, lawyers who could make her life hell, even if they couldn't put her in prison. And this time she'd drag Rhett down with her. The ranch, Clara, everyone she'd come to care about. She could run, take Crow's deal, refuse to testify, hope he kept his word, or she could fight, risk everything, trust that the truth would be enough. Margaret sat on those steps for an hour, watching Denver move around her before she made her decision. She went straight to Marshal Garrett's office. He listened to her story without interrupting, his expression darkening as she explained Crow's threat. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He's cornered, Garrett said finally. His appeal is failing. He's desperate. This is all he has left. So what do I do? You tell the truth. At the appeal hearing, on record, you explain exactly what happened in Boston, why you ran, and why Vernon Crow is using it to threaten you now. That'll destroy me. Maybe. Or maybe it'll set you free. Garrett leaned forward. You've been running from Boston for over a year, running from a scandal you didn't cause. At some point, you have to stop running and face it. The Hartfords will come after me. Let them. You have witnesses now, a community, a husband who'd fight hell itself for you. That's more than you had before. Margaret thought about the valley, about the people she'd treated, about Rhett and Clara and the life she'd built from nothing. About whether it was worth protecting. Okay, she said, I'll testify. The appeal hearing was set for 3 weeks later. Margaret spent those weeks preparing, working with Garrett to document everything. The threat, the blackmail, the leverage Crow was trying to use. She also wrote a letter to the Hartford family explaining what had really happened the night Rebecca died. She didn't send it yet, just kept it as insurance, as proof that she was done hiding. Rhett found her the night before the hearing, sitting on the porch watching the stars. You don't have to do this, he said. Yes, I do. We could leave. Take Clara and disappear. Start over somewhere Crow and the Hartfords can't find us. Margaret looked at him. At this man who'd been willing to die for his land, who'd fought a war to protect his home, who'd stood against impossible odds because running wasn't in him. You wouldn't leave, she said. This ranch is your home, your family's legacy. You'd never abandon it. I'd abandon it for you. The words hung in the air between them, simple, true, devastating. I know, Margaret said quietly, but I won't let you. This is my fight, my past, and I'm done letting it control my future. The hearing took place in a Denver courthouse packed with spectators. Crow's lawyers had done their job well. The room was full of people ready to see the great Vernon Crow vindicated, ready to watch his conviction overturned. Margaret sat in the witness stand and told the truth. She explained Boston, explained the surgery where Dr. Hartford had been drunk and incompetent and killed his own patient while Margaret tried desperately to save her, explained how the family had blamed her to protect their reputation, how they'd threatened prosecution if she didn't accept responsibility quietly. She explained running, explained the months in the cabin, explained finding Rhett dying in the snow, and then she explained Crow's threat, the blackmail, the attempt to use her past as leverage. The courtroom went silent when she finished. Crow's lawyer stood up, trying to discredit her, trying to paint her as a liar and a criminal. But Garrett had done his work well. He had documentation. Witnesses who'd seen Margaret's skill as a nurse, letters from Valley families she'd helped. And then, unexpectedly, someone else stood up. A man in the back of the courtroom, well-dressed, authoritative. He identified himself as Thomas Hartford, Rebecca's brother. I've heard enough, he said. His voice carried across the silent room. My sister's death was a tragedy, but it wasn't this woman's fault. It was my father's. He was drunk. He was incompetent, and he sacrificed Miss Callahan to save his own reputation. The courtroom erupted. Crow's lawyer shouted objections. The judge banged his gavel, but Thomas Hartford kept talking. I've spent the last year investigating what really happened that night. I found nurses who witnessed my father's drinking, surgical records that show his declining skill, evidence that my family suppressed to protect his career. He looked at Margaret. I came here to apologize to you, and to make sure my father faces consequences instead of you. Margaret couldn't breathe, couldn't process what was happening. The Hartford family destroying their own reputation to clear her name. The vindication she'd never thought she'd get. The judge called for order, reviewed the new evidence, dismissed the appeal. Vernon Crowe would stay in prison. And Margaret Callahan Dalton was finally, truly free. She walked out of that courthouse into Denver sunlight with Rhett beside her and Thomas Hartford shaking her hand. I'm sorry, he said, for what my family did to you, for the year you lost running, for everything. Why did you come forward? Because my sister deserved better than to be used as a weapon, and because wrong is wrong, no matter who commits it. He paused. I've filed charges against my father. He'll face a medical board review, probably lose his license, but that's not your concern anymore. You're free of us. Margaret didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to process a world where powerful families faced consequences instead of inflicting them. Thank you, she managed finally. Thomas nodded and left. Margaret turned to Rhett. It's really over, she said. It's really over. They went back to the valley. Back to the ranch and the clinic and the life they'd built. Margaret threw herself into work, expanding the clinic, training local women in basic medicine, building something that would outlast her. Clara's seizures became manageable with the right medication, something Margaret found by corresponding with doctors back east who actually listened instead of dismissing women's health as hysteria. The episodes still happened, but less frequently, and Clara learned to live around them instead of letting them define her. The valley continued to heal. The water cooperative grew stronger. Ranches that had been failing started to recover. Families that had been scattered by Crowe's war came back home. And Margaret stopped having nightmares. It didn't happen all at once, but gradually, over months and then years, the dreams of fire faded. The panic attacks became less frequent. The waiting for disaster shifted into something closer to peace. 5 years after the wedding, Margaret stood in her clinic treating a young woman's broken arm when she felt it. A flutter in her stomach, a movement that wasn't hers. She was pregnant. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd spent so long surviving, so long fighting, that she'd forgotten to think about a future that included children. A future that was about building instead of defending. She told Rhett that night, watched his face transform from shock to joy to something deeper that didn't have words. We're having a baby, he said, like he couldn't quite believe it. We're having a baby. They held each other in the darkness, two people who'd survived hell together, now creating something new, something hopeful, something that represented a future instead of a past. The baby came 8 months later, a girl with Rhett's dark hair and Margaret's stubborn chin. They named her Sarah, after Rhett's mother, and she screamed loud enough to wake the entire ranch when she was born. Margaret held her daughter and felt something shift inside her chest. All the broken pieces she'd carried from Boston, all the fear and shame and guilt, suddenly seemed smaller, less important, because this tiny human didn't care about scandal or reputation or who Margaret used to be. She only cared that Margaret was there. 2 years later, they had a son, then another daughter. The ranch house filled with noise and chaos and the kind of messy, imperfect life that Margaret had never imagined for herself. Clara never married. She ran the ranch business, managed the water cooperative, became one of the most respected voices in the valley. Her seizures were part of her, not something to hide or be ashamed of, and she taught that attitude to every kid who asked why she sometimes fell down. The clinic grew into a proper hospital. Margaret trained 3 women to work alongside her, passing on knowledge that had once been hoarded by men who thought women couldn't handle medicine. Together, they handled everything from births to bullet wounds to the mundane illnesses that filled small-town life. Elias Crowe never came back to the valley. He disappeared into witness protection and stayed disappeared. But Margaret sometimes got letters from places like San Francisco or St. Louis, unsigned but clearly from him, checking that his father was still in prison, still unable to hurt anyone. Vernon Crowe died in his cell 7 years after his conviction. Heart attack, the official report said. Margaret didn't attend the funeral, didn't mourn, just marked it as another ending and moved on. Thomas Hartford became a vocal advocate for medical reform. He exposed his father's malpractice, testified before boards, helped change laws that protected incompetent doctors at the expense of patients. He and Margaret exchanged letters occasionally, a strange friendship built on shared trauma and mutual respect. And every winter, when snow covered the mountains, Margaret would stand on the ranch porch with Rhett and remember. Remember the cabin where she'd hidden. Remember finding him dying in a blizzard. Remember the choice she'd made to save a stranger instead of protecting herself. "Do you ever regret it?" Rhett asked her one evening. Their children were inside with Clara, and they had stolen a rare moment of quiet. Everything that happened, the fighting, the danger, all of it. Margaret thought about the question, about the life she'd lost in Boston and the one she'd found here, about scars physical and emotional that would never fully heal, about nightmares that still sometimes woke her in the darkness. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it, because all of that brought me here. To you. To them." She gestured at the house where their children's laughter echoed, to a life that's real instead of perfect. "It's pretty imperfect," Rhett agreed. "Good. Perfect is boring." They stood there watching the sun set over the valley they'd fought to protect. The valley that had almost destroyed them but ultimately became their home. Margaret had learned something in the years since that frozen night. She'd learned that survival isn't the same as living, that sometimes the scariest thing you can do is stop running and build something worth protecting. That family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who stand beside you when everything's burning and choose to stay anyway. She'd learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying your scars forward and refusing to let them define you. She'd learned that second chances exist, but you have to be brave enough to take them. And most importantly, she'd learned that the woman she used to be, the one who hid in a cabin waiting to die, wasn't weak. She was just waiting for something worth fighting for. Inside the house, one of the children called for her. Margaret squeezed Rhett's hand and turned to go. Turned toward the noise and chaos and beautiful mess of a life she'd built from nothing. Behind her, the mountains stood eternal, already gathering snow for another winter. But Margaret wasn't afraid of the cold anymore. She'd survived worse than winter. She'd survived herself. And that, she thought, as she walked into the warmth and light of home, was the real victory. Not defeating Vernon Crow or clearing her name or building a hospital, but learning to believe she deserved this, deserved happiness, deserved a future. The starving nurse who found a dying cowboy in the snow had become someone new, someone stronger, someone who understood that redemption isn't about erasing your past. It's about building a future in spite of it. And as Margaret Dalton stepped through the door to help her daughter with homework and settle an argument between her sons and steal a quiet moment with her husband before the chaos started again, she knew one thing for certain. She was finally, completely home.